Welcome to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bezanson.
And we are your host, and we are both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions. Phil, what's on our docket for today?
So this is another quick hit episode. It's similar to the discussion that we had about the Theranos trial a couple weeks ago. So it's just the two of us, and we're going to be talking about something that is, grabbed the headlines of the last 5 or 6 days and is a rapidly changing series of current events. We're going to talk about Russia, Ukraine, sanctions, cybersecurity, and other potential legal issues to spot as organizations around the world attempt to react to these current events and really to anticipate, hopefully, what might happen next, with, of course, the warning that we are in some respects trying to predict the military plannings of a regime that's acting without much rational basis and in a context of almost global criticism, scorn, and as we'll talk about, sanctions. So predicting what might happen with crazy people is a hard thing to do, but we're going to take a stab at it anyway. So I think the first thing that we want to touch on is this rapidly changing, evolving sanctions regime, or the sanctions that are being put out. Remember, listeners, that a few weeks ago we had an episode that now may be more prescient than we thought with our good friend Matt Bell, who talked about lots of different things involving sanctions. Matthew, I don't know if you want to touch on some of the highlights from that to kind of catch people up, and then we can jump into some of the things that we've seen over the last couple of days that really organizations, individuals, companies should be thinking about.
Yeah. It was, kind of going back to that episode, it was, Matt did a great job of trying to explain pretty complicated regime. But in the United States, really what we're talking about here are two primary methods of imposing sanctions, one by the Commerce Department, another by the Treasury Department. So Treasury will issue sanctions to prevent people from doing business in certain regions of the world and with certain people, and specifically also relating to financial business and banking relationships. And Commerce is going to be involved in restricting selling certain types of goods and technology. And so really there's kind of a large-scale coordinated effort here, not only with the U.S. side, but with our partners around the world, including the EU and the UK and other countries, issuing similar sanctions in a pretty unprecedented manner with such a large global power as Russia. Not to date this too much, but this morning, might give a clue to our listeners when we're recording this, but this morning, the really unprecedented move that kind of shocked the sanctions world was a unilateral prohibition and sanctions targeted towards the Central Bank of Russia, which just really, I don't think have seen that with such a global power as Russia. But there's this kind of increasing tranche of sanctions that are really geared towards shutting down the Russian economy and, quite frankly, probably leading it to somewhat of a recession.
Right. And I think one of the things that a lot of people are still wondering about, because it's not just a Russia isolation issue, it's what's going to happen with the energy export market with Russia, right, and sort of going the other way, the energy technology import market in Russia. I think that's one of the things that certainly is an issue for the, export control regime in normal times. But I think right now in particular, it's not just things like arms and ammunition and military technology that, a layperson thinks of as military technology that may be at issue here, but even things that could have some sort of energy sector application, either directly or indirectly. If you're doing business with Russia in the energy markets, and things have not been touched by sanctions yet. They may never be touched by sanctions because of Europe's reliance on Russian energy exports, but they may become touched. So it's certainly something to anticipate and prepare for.
Yeah, the United States is, I think, still holding that out as targeting the specifically energy sector. Europe has been a little bit more aggressive on that. Of course, they're a little bit more reliant on Russian energy exports than the United States is. But to your point, while there hasn't been a direct targeting of the Russian energy, what requires a license to export to Russia has been greatly expanded over this last weekend. The reality is that if you're trying to export goods or software to Russia, you got to pay really close attention because military end use has been expanded significantly for the vast majority of exports. And so there's going to be prohibitions against exporting to certain people in certain regions. And there is a now presumption of denial of those exports. And so if you're doing trade, we can talk a little bit about doing banking or financial transactions, but just exporting goods to Russia is going to be significantly, people are going to need to pay really close attention to what's happening there if that's what they're planning on doing.
Right. And there's a flip side to that as well, which is organizations that want to reach out and provide assistance to Ukraine. You know, there's been a ton of attention paid to the sanctions that have been added to deal with Russia, but not that much of a reminder put out that, you know, export controls, not necessarily sanctions, but export controls on technology with a direct or perhaps indirect, but, you know, otherwise military application still are covered by a fairly detailed and in some cases time-consuming license application process. So any organization thinking about, oh, we have technology, we can find end users in Ukraine who would benefit from this technology, we want to make the technology available. As far as I've seen so far, there's been no moratorium or, you know, safe harbor applied to the currently existing export control regime for military goods or goods with a military use that would allow people to just send stuff to Ukraine without going through the normal license process.
No, that's exactly right. Well, and then on the, you know, OFAC side, the Treasury Department, you know, essentially between what the U.S. is doing and what our allies in Europe are doing is essentially shutting off the Russian access to the financial markets and the banking markets. You know, we saw that they've been removed from the SWIFT automation that allows them to easily transact business with banks throughout the world. So that's been cut off. The assets of the central bank and large other closely held government banks have been blocked and are being held, the assets, so that the government can't kind of offset these sanctions. And essentially, you know, people are generally being prohibited from dealing with Russian banks in any way, any kind of U.S. person or people that are held by U.S. people. And so they're really just being isolated and shut off. And so if you have any kind of business with a Russian counterpart or any way related to any kind of Russian bank or investment company, very likely you're going to have a block there. And certainly before you do anything like that, you need to consult counsel and really pay close attention.
Right. And that also adds another layer of challenges because you have a large number of Russian individuals who have been added to the list. And one of the concerns there is that it's sometimes hard to track who the final owner or the most beneficial interest holder is in, you know, different business organizations that are set up around the world in real estate holdings and other investment opportunities or other investment offices where there may be someone a few layers back who previously had not had any problems participating in the U.S. marketplace, but now maybe. So there's additional digging or going back and looking through ownership structures to make sure that business as usual with organizations that appear to be unrelated to Russia do not, in fact, have ultimate ownership with people who have just been added to the list.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing business, especially in Europe, and if you're not doing kind of real-time screening of your customers or your counterparties, it's time to update that and look again, because, like you said, not only is the U.S. and Europe focused on Vladimir Putin and some of the other people in the actual government, but a lot of the wealthy individuals who support that government as well and their companies. So on the other side of this, severe sanctions, act with all due care and take it one step at a time there. But Phil, you put out a really good piece the other day about what we might expect to see in retribution to that, specifically relating to potential cyber attacks.
Right. So thanks, Matt. The cyber attack landscape associated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine it has a Hollywood component to it, because from what sort of initial reports look like, Ukraine was bombarded with a variety of different cyber attacks in the days leading up to Russia's invasion. The initial analytics of some of those attacks suggest that the systems that were affected had most likely been impacted or infected, weeks and weeks ahead of time, and that malicious code had been lying dormant in wait for sort of this moment to happen. And what in fact did happen is, we've talked about ransomware in the past recently with Seth Ducharme, but the effect is similar to ransomware in that systems are crippled. But there's a hugely significant difference in that ransomware is at the end a commercial transaction where hackers will presumably return systems to normal or near normal in exchange for money. In these politically motivated attacks, like the hackers conducting the attacks on Ukrainian systems, they used data wiping malware rather than data encrypting malware. And they also distributed something called denial of service attacks, which are essentially flooding systems with false pings to cripple them and render them ineffective. So the systems really are not the final target of these kinds of politically motivated attacks. Instead, the idea is to target systems because they play a role in critical infrastructure, such as airport management or power grid management or other necessary communications. And they essentially make it impossible for networked activities to function as normal, which creates uncertainty and, in some cases, chaos. You have a parallel with this that I think we've seen now over the last few days are things like disinformation campaigns, which cause additional confusion regarding the scope or consequences of an attack. And one of the most zeroed in targets are things like internet news sources, which get bombarded with information or purported information without sufficient time or backup to really scrutinize. So there's a prospect of highly unreliable, quote unquote, news that's getting broadcast in tandem with cyber attacks that make it harder and harder to verify the accuracy of the news. So, while that's happening in Ukraine, one of the things to think about is what do we need to be prepared for here? And while, it's probably more alarmist than necessary to say that U.S. networks will be subject to a similar broad scope attack, there are things to think about to prepare for any sort of, denial of service attacks or other kinds of data wiping malware. The most basic things are things like patch management, other cyber hygiene protocols, making sure software is up to date, making sure vulnerabilities are identified and taken care of. And then, the other component to it, which is directly cyber applicable, but cyber adjacent, is, what to do about supply chain disruption. I don't know, Matt, if you want to talk a little bit about supply chain disruption and what to think about there. I know that's something that you've looked at a lot recently.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at it and we've dealt with it through COVID because it can start raising some legal issues, especially on a concept called force majeure. If you essentially can't fulfill your contractual obligations because of circumstances beyond your control, and that certainly can be a possibility if, the supply chain is disrupted. But, this is a purely contractual matter. It's one in which you have to pay close attention to your particular contracts because they may have notice requirements and kind of preconditions to invoking that. But, that's certainly something that, people need to be on the lookout for, is essentially either because of the effects of sanctions, directly or indirectly, you're unable to get goods or services that are needed to fulfill your other contractual obligations. You need to pay close attention to it, and to the other side as well, that, if you can't, if you're impacted by sanctions and directly and therefore you can't fulfill your orders, you need to pay close attention to your contractual relationships there and make sure that you're providing the right amount of notice and that you're fulfilling any kind of requirements to try to fulfill that order elsewhere.
Right. So there's a lot to think about right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot to think about for planning ahead. I expect that we and other colleagues of ours are going to be putting out more information as things develop, and certainly we'll all be keeping a close eye on things that develop on the ground in Ukraine. So I think we'll close out for now and say that you can get Sidebar at the Bracewell webpage and everywhere else you get your podcasts. And until next time, stay out of trouble.